Okay, we will now start our discussion on the adaptive immune system. I'll remind you that this is often referred to as our third line of defense. It is not innate, meaning you're not born with this working as hard as it can. It needs to adapt or grow or mature with time. So this part of your immune system needs some time to get better and better and better. And that happens with exposure to the environment, exposure to microbes, and it gets even stronger after you have an illness. All right, so what we're going to do is start to talk about some of the organs that play important roles, but also the cell types. All right, and the adaptive immune system is going to revolve around lymphocytes. Now, there's going to be other cells that help out with the lymphocytes, but we really want to understand how three of our lymphocytes function. Those three are the cytotoxic T cells, the helper T cells, and the B cells. So these are all lymphocytes that participate in this adaptive immune system. So this system gets better. It also is very specific. And the specificity happens to be with the receptors that these cells have. These cells have what's called antigen receptors. And those antigen receptors are what these cells use to detect antigens. And antigens are any kind of foreign substance. It could be a toxin, it could be a virus, it could be bacteria. Anything that's foreign that we need to rid the body of is known as an antigen. Okay, what are the major organs? Well, we've got what's known as primary lymphatic organs. Those are the organs that form the immune cells. So that's your bone marrow. Your bone marrow is where all your lymphocytes are produced. But we also need to look at the thymus, because the thymus is where T cells need to go to mature. So they allow maturation of the T cells, only the T cells. And that's where T comes from. T comes from the fact that they go to the thymus. So those are your primary lymphatic organs. The B cells, when they're formed in your bone marrow, they're ready to go. All right, they're mature and they're ready to go function. The T cells that leave the bone marrow are often referred to as pre-T cells. They're not quite ready until they go to the thymus. They further mature there, and then when they leave the thymus, they're ready to go. Where do these mature T cells and B cells go? They go to what's called secondary lymphatic organs, and that's where they're going to function. So if they find a pathogen, that's where they're going to function. What are some examples? Lymph nodes, which we'll talk a lot about on the next slide. The spleen is a secondary lymphatic organ. Tonsils, if you've heard of tonsils that are in your kind of along your throat area in the back of your mouth, are secondary lymphatic organs. So that's where most of these lymphocytes are going to go. Okay, so now the question is, how does a cytotoxic T cell work? What does it do to help us? What do helper T cells do? And then what do B cells do? So they're all going to go to this green square here, which represents any of the secondary lymphatic organs. Let's pretend this is a lymph node. All right, and we'll look at kind of what a lymph node actually looks like on the next slide. But lymph nodes get lymph. So remember, lymph gets collected from tissue. Lymph is going to be interstitial fluid that might have a pathogen, right? What if you have an infection somewhere? We're going to collect that fluid that might have that infectious organism. It's then going to get into a lymph node, and now we've got lymphocytes there. And these lymphocytes have to undergo a few steps. So one of the steps is known as activation. All right, and that happens when the lymphocyte uses its antigen receptor to detect the pathogen or the antigen. When that happens, they will then proliferate. And proliferation basically means cloning. The cells undergo mitosis to generate more and more of that same exact lymphocyte. All right, so cloning happens to increase the number of these cytotoxic cells, helper cells, or B cells. And then they go do what they do, which we'll talk about here in a minute down at this point here. Now, notice that the helpers, helper, what does that mean? Well, it kind of means they help, all right? But helping sounds like it's not necessarily required, but it is. You have to have helper T cells. And notice they're going to help both cytotoxic and B cells become activated. All right. So if you don't have the helpers, if something is destroying them, you won't have any adaptive immune response. And that happens with individuals with AIDS. So AIDS is due to a virus, the HIV virus, that destroys the helper T cells. And if you don't have helpers, you're not going to be able to activate your cytotoxics nor your B cells. So helper T cells help by releasing chemicals that help proliferate your cytotoxic T cells and B cells. So now the question is, well, what do cytotoxic T cells do and what do B cells do? So cytotoxic T cells, when they proliferate and clone, they're going to look for any kind of cell that shouldn't be there, or a cell that is infected by a virus. So that's usually what happens. So I want you to think about a virus. So the virus could be the flu, it could be the common cold, it could be COVID, it could be a norovirus that causes the stomach flu. Viruses have to infect a cell. They have to get into what we call a host cell. So like the flu virus infects a respiratory cell. It gets into that cell and starts to replicate. So the best way to destroy the virus is to destroy and kill the infected cell first. Then we can destroy the virus. All right? So notice what the cytotoxic T cells do. They're going to attack intracellular pathogens. Those are pathogens that have gotten into a cell. And again, that's usually a virus. They could also kill certain cancer cells, so they're out there helping prevent cancer. And they could kill other cells that look foreign, which could be in a transplant. So if someone has like a kidney transplant or a heart transplant, those cells look foreign. And unfortunately, you're going to have cytotoxic T cells trying to kill them. So anyone that has a transplant, an organ transplant, has to be put on immunosuppressant drugs to suppress this attack. So this whole process, when we're talking about cytotoxic T cells, is called cell-mediated immunity. What that means is we're using a cell, cytotoxic T cells, to kill other cells. And those other cells are either virally infected or cancer cells or foreign cells, possibly from a transplant. All right. Now, what do B cells do? Well, when B cells get activated, they also clone. They also become clones, right? They proliferate, but they're going to produce antibodies. And when they're actively secreting antibodies, they're called plasma cells or plasma B cells. So then what do antibodies do? Well, antibodies go into your body fluids. They're going to go into lymph. They're going to go into blood. They're going to go into interstitial fluid. They can go into sweat and saliva. They go into breast milk. They go into intestinal secretions. And what the antibodies do is they're going to look for antigens and inactivate them. All right. But notice where they are. They're in the extracellular area. So notice what we got now. We've got a way to get to pathogens if they get into cells. We have a way to get to pathogens if they're outside of cells. And there's nowhere else to hide if you're a pathogen, right? If you're a pathogen, you're either in a cell or you're outside of a cell. And we got a way to find you, all right? So what else does this picture show? It shows the fact that some of our cells, some of our helpers, some of our cytotoxic, and some of our B cells become what's called memory cells. Memory cells are not going to participate in the current infection, but they're going to stick around for a subsequent secondary infection. So now, if you get infected by that same pathogen, you've got a whole bunch of lymphocytes already ready to roll and ready to fight. And this is why you develop immunity, all right, whether it's from an infection or from a vaccine. It's because exposure to a pathogen causes the production of memory lymphocytes. All right, so I love this figure because it shows a lot, but it's a great introduction and a great review. If you're ever looking for some of these figures in your textbook, I don't know if anyone buys a textbook or even looks at a textbook anymore, but these are not from our current textbook. There's certain figures that I just can't get rid of and use another version of it. So this is from a previous book that I just prefer this figure over any other figure that introduces the adaptive immune system. All right? Okay, so let's talk a little more about these organs. Primary lymphatic organs, I'll remind you, the bone marrow is one, and that's found in bones. And then the thymus is the second, all right? The second primary lymphatic organ. Where is your thymus? It's found in your thoracic cavity in between your lungs. We call that the mediastinum. It lies just behind your sternum and just in front of the aorta. So you can see the aorta kind of tucked behind the thymus. And it sits right on top of your heart. It has two lobes to it. Inside this thymus, there's going to be a lot of macrophages. There's going to be a lot of cells called dendritic cells. There's going to be endocrine cells producing a lot of hormones that are going to aid in the maturation process. And it's going to have a bunch of T cells. And only about 2% of the T cells that enter the thymus are going to get to leave the thymus. All right, so that's like if you took an AMP class and only 2% of the class passed. Now, it sounds terrible, but I'm assuming those 2% are really good AMP students. So that's kind of the theory here behind the thymus. You want the thymus to be very selective. You want it to only select the very best T cells. Remember, one of the analogies we like to use with the immune system is like our military, right? And we want the best of the best out there fighting against the enemy. All right. So what do you do with the other 98%? You kill them and you remove them. And that's what these dendritic cells and macrophages do. They get rid of any of the T cells that just aren't cut out to be a T cell. All right. Now, why is this so important? If you're not a very good T cell, you might make a big mistake and start to attack, instead of, bad guys, maybe you start to attack the good guys. And we don't want that. All right. That's called an autoimmune disease. All right. So that's the thymus. All right, let's talk a little more about our secondary lymphatic organs. We've got the lymph nodes, all right? So there's about, 600 or more lymph nodes. Remember, they lie along lymphatic vessels, all right? There are vessels that bring lymph into them. So notice these arrows represent what direction lymph is flowing. If you're bringing lymph into the lymph node, you're an afferent vessel. Remember, the word afferent means you're going towards something. You're bringing the lymph into the lymph node. Then the lymph kind of trickles through the lymph node, and this lymph node has a lot of reticular connective tissue. I don't know if you remember that from AMP1, but that helps to trap any kind of pathogen or foreign substance. And then we're going to attack it. So inside this lymph node, there's going to be a bunch of T lymphocytes, cytotoxic T cells, helper T cells. It's going to be loaded with B cells. So if any of those lymphocytes see that there's a pathogen, yes, it's going to kill the pathogen, but they're also going to be activated and they're going to proliferate. And if you're a B cell in here, you're going to start to secrete antibodies that flow out with the lymph in the efferent vessel. So efferent means the lymph is exiting the lymph node. So this lymph that exits the lymph node is filtered, so pathogens have been removed, but it might be loaded with antibodies. And those antibodies are going to then go where? Where does lymph go? Lymph goes into your subclavian veins. So now you got a bunch of antibodies going into your bloodstream. And when you have antibodies in your bloodstream, where can the antibodies go? They can go everywhere. They can get to all tissues. And they're going to attack that same pathogen that entered the lymph node. And sometimes when lymph nodes have lymphocytes that get activated, it's going to swell. So a lot of times you know when this is happening because you have swollen lymph nodes. So you get swollen lymph nodes in your neck, usually when there's a pathogen in your upper respiratory tract. So when you have a sore throat or something, you get swollen lymph nodes. If you have a pathogen maybe in an infected toe, let's say you have a really nasty infection in your toe, you might get lymph nodes swollen in your groin because that lymph is going to drain up and activate those lymph nodes in the groin. All right? So what are some of the names we give lymph nodes? Axillary or in your armpit. So those might swell if you have a really bad infection in your arm and you're activating those lymph nodes. Cervical or in your neck. Mediastinal or in your mediastinum. Hilar are by your lungs. They're the ones that get lymph from the lungs. And if you have an infection in the lungs, they might get swollen. Now, you can't really feel them in there because they're in your chest. Mesenteric are in the mesentery, which attaches to your small intestines. So those are in your abdomen. Inguinal are in your groin. And femoral are in your thigh. So we name lymph nodes based on the region. Where else do you find lymphocytes? Your spleen. Your spleen is actually the largest secondary lymphatic organ. It's found in your left hypochondriac region of your abdomen, kind of your upper left quadrant of your abdomen. It's kind of situated between the left part of your stomach and below your diaphragm. It's got two types of tissue. We already kind of learned about one function of the spleen. If you remember, it removes red blood cells and platelets. That's in the red pulp. The white pulp is what contains your lymphatic tissue. And the spleen kind of is like a lymph node, but it doesn't get lymph, it gets blood flow. All right, so there's a lot of blood that flows into your spleen. So your spleen doesn't look for pathogens in lymph, it looks for pathogens in your bloodstream. So we call those bloodborne pathogens. And then that red pulp, again, does the removal of red blood cells, platelets. It stores extra platelets in case you need them if you're bleeding. And then it actually produces some of the blood cells during fetal development. So that's your spleen. You've probably heard the fact that you can remove a spleen and still survive. All right, so it's not a vital organ, but people who do have the spleen removed have to be very cautious if they get an infection that gets into the bloodstream, because they might not be able to, remove it as well as you would with a spleen. And then a lot of the functions will be taken over by your liver. So your liver is going to do the removal of these red blood cells and platelets. What else? Besides my dogs barking. You've got other secondary lymphatic organs that are called nodules. They're not actually enclosed. So a spleen has kind of a capsule that forms the organ. So do lymph nodes. But you happen to have kind of masses of lymphatic tissue in certain locations, and those are called nodules. You got some that reside in your mucous membranes. They're called mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. So that would be found along mucous membranes of your GI tract, respiratory tract. Tonsils. Tonsils are strategically located where pathogens like to enter. So you've got what's called the pharyngeal tonsil or adenoid, which is in the nasopharynx, which is the part of your throat that's behind your nose, behind your nasal cavity. So when you breathe in air, that air basically hits the back of your throat, and you've got a patch of lymphatic tissue there. You've got palatine tonsils, which are on each side of your palate in your back of your mouth. So you can see those in the back of the mouth. And then at the base of the tongue, which is way in the back of the tongue, there's tonsils there as well. And then finally, you got some larger patches in the ileum of the small intestine, which are referred to as Peyer's patches. So this is where, again, like a lymph node, you're going to have a ton of lymphocytes and other immune cells. Okay, next topic we're going to do in a separate video. It's, to me, one of the most interesting topics in A&P. It's known as antigen presentation. So the basic idea is lymphocytes need to be shown antigens. They need to be shown what the pathogen looks like. And that's done using what we call antigen presentation. So basically we got some cells that can show the lymphocytes, hey, look at what's out there. There's this foreign entity. This is what it looks like. Your job is to get all angry, proliferate, and go find them. All right? So we're going to do a separate video on that process.